Good morning. This is being recorded on April 14th. The topic is going to be the era of carnage. But before I launch into that, let me just say that the news this morning is that the man who was illegally taken to El Salvador is, according to our president and the president of El Salvador, not being returned because the courts can't determine U.S. foreign policy, it is said. And in addition, more prisons will be built in El Salvador, and even U.S. regular citizens can be sent there in the future. So that's the news of the morning. But let me get to my topic. The era of carnage. So the first question, of course, is what is the definition of carnage? I Googled it for our collective knowledge, and it says brutal slaughter of many people with great damage and or chaos that results from such violence. So that's what I want to talk about, because I will submit to you that one of the real crises in the world right now is the carnage that is going on. And where is it going on? In lots of places. So let me run down some of them and talk about them. Obviously, the Sudan, obviously, Gaza, obviously, Myanmar, obviously, the Congo, obviously, the Ukraine, obviously, lots of places. And we as Americans, and given our government, are complicit in some of these. So let me start with the obvious, Gaza. Yes, there was carnage of Israelis on October, whatever it was, 7th. But now we're talking about a year plus later, and somewhere between 50 and 60,000 Gazans have been killed, and many more maimed and permanently damaged. And the conflict continues. And the Israeli president has just announced that Israel is going to take over the northern part of Gaza. I think about 22 million people of the Gazans, and they may also be moving into the southern part. And Netanyahu, and to some extent our president, has agreed it would be best if the Palestinians would simply move out and go to other countries, and then the place can be rebuilt. And of course, as you recall, Trump has in mind building casinos and hotels because the coast along Gaza is lovely. But in the meantime, carnage is going on and continues. And the latest version of that has been something that you've heard about in the news, but I will just reiterate, which was the attack on the ambulances and the people killed, who were all medical workers, ambulance drivers, and so forth. You will recall that the Israelis first said, well, they were sorry they attacked this convoy of ambulances because they couldn't tell there were ambulances because it was dark, and they were looking for a Hamas person. And then it turns out when the Israelis buried these people in a shallow grave, later on the graves were dug up by the Palestinians, and they found next to the body of one of the ambulance people who was killed a cell phone. He had taken on his cell phone photos of the ambulances. Their lights were on, their signals were on. In other words, it was not true that this was all dark and oops, the Israelis made a mistake. They could see exactly what it was. Well, probably there was a Hamas person somewhere, and since this event, the final hospital in Gaza which is only semi-operational, has been in the last couple of days attacked. In short, if you want to say carnage is going on, it is not just going on with the bombing and the attacks of the military, but it is also going on in terms of simply getting rid of the people of the Palestinians in Gaza, not to mention the horrors being visited upon Palestinians in the West Bank right now, which the right wing of the Israeli government believes should also be taken up by Israel. This is a level of carnage which is against all the rules and all the laws and all the courts that were developed in the last 80 years after the Second World War, and which are operational, but which neither the United States nor the Israeli government has the slightest notion of letting those courts rule. There is, as you probably know, a charge of genocide against the Israelis, but it is not being acknowledged at this moment. And it is also the case that Netanyahu is considered now a war criminal and therefore could be arrested by any of the members of the International Criminal Court, but neither Israel nor the United States are members of the International Criminal Court. And for that matter, when Netanyahu visited Hungary recently, the Hungarians quit the International Criminal Court, which meant that neither Hungary nor the United States can or would be able to arrest him under the auspices of the obligation of the International Criminal Court. The US never joined the International Criminal Court. So the situation in the Palestinian areas, I think what the definition of carnage can be applied to what is going on there. Then let's jump quickly to the Sudan, a rather big country geographically, also in terms of population on the African continent, which has been in the middle of a civil war for some time. And by any definition of carnage, that is what is going on. People are getting killed right and left, children, adults, it doesn't seem to matter. It is true that the military of the previous government is now back in control of the capital, but even there, what is going on there falls under the definition of carnage. Now, then there is a different kind of carnage going on, which I suppose is, you could say, is not the consequence of policy, which is what happened after the earthquake in Myanmar. So far, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people have been killed, and they're still digging people out. And you can say, well, that's a natural phenomenon. The earthquake caused the carnage, and humans didn't much contribute to it. But allow me to say that when these serious earthquakes have happened elsewhere, for example, in Turkey, one of the dominant country which came to the rescue, and within the first 72 hours when people could be rescued, managed to rescue a lot of people and also look out for them afterwards. The US, since USAID is no longer for all practical purpose in existence, which means that the teams that would have come from the US government to help out in the Myanmar situation have not arrived and will not arrive, because we have now washed our hands of all the activities that would aid or prevent carnage in various countries in civil wars and help rescue people and allow them to survive. Ironically, just a side point here, the two USAID officials were in fact in Myanmar at the end of the earthquake. I can't get clear whether they were already in the country or whether they were a neighboring country and could get there very quickly. And so there were actually two Americans who used to work for the USAID available, not armies of people and dogs and so on, but just two individuals. While these two individuals were in Myanmar trying to help out, they got a notification as part of the firings of the employees of USAID that they had just been fired. A kind of an irony, right? Here they're trying to help, and in fact, while they're doing it, they get notified that they no longer have a job. So natural phenomenon like an earthquake or a major flood can lead to human carnage, not man-made at all, but due to natural causes. But very often the carnage can then come post the event when people who didn't used to have to die and could be rescued are now not now being in a position to rescue. You might ask before I move on as to who's doing the rescuing in Myanmar. Well, the Chinese came in there in a big way. They have teams because China has had earthquakes and they have some experience, but as have neighboring countries, for example, Thailand, for example, Indonesia, and so forth. So countries in the region have stepped up, as well as some international actors from the United Nations and non-governmental organizations, which have helped not just in Gaza, but in various parts of the world. For example, Doctors Without Borders and so forth. In the case of Gaza, most of those people have been kicked out by the Israelis. But in many other parts, when there is man-made or natural environmental carnage going on, and the violence that comes with many people dying, you could call that violence if they can't be rescued. Those organizations are not only very helpful and very important, but they become dysfunctional very often due to funding cuts. And let me give you a Sudan example. The Sudan, due to its civil wars and conflicts, have real human carnage that has been going on for some time, and as well as recently. And so what you've had is non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Borders coming in to help with healthcare and rescuing people from injuries and so forth. And then those people who are refugees and or who are already maimed obviously need to eat, and therefore international institutions have come in to help feed the population. So, for example, in the capital, there were medical facilities run by international non-governmental organizations. And right adjacent to it were soup kitchens and so forth, run by a group paid for by, by USAID, and of course that stopped. So the doctors could not provide nourishment for their patients because the US just went out of business of providing the food support. Is this carnage? You can decide, but in any event, it is a form of violence when aid possibilities, keeping people alive, providing medical care was available, and now is being withdrawn because the U.S. is no longer interested in helping people. There are other areas where you could say carnage is going on. The Congo is quite serious carnage is going on right now. And there again, the agencies which might help people who become homeless and injured are necessarily available, so far more people are dying. And even in the Ukraine, I mean, was it yesterday that in a small town in eastern Ukraine, the Russians killed, I think, 30 people, was it 30? Um, and are trying to mow down as many people as possible, to make sure, I suppose, that if there is negotiation, that they have the upper hand in various regions of eastern Ukraine. But there's also additional sort of violence that is resulting during this Ukrainian-Russian conflict. For example, last week you might have seen on TV, there was photos of the Russians shooting a whole circle of POWs from the Ukraine, captured soldiers of Ukraine. They were having a big circle and they were just going around shooting them all dead. Now, this is, again, against international law, and this is a form of violence which qualifies for the word carnage. And it is the sort of thing that you would think would not be happening right now, that POWs would be treated not just reasonably, but if not reasonably, at least they wouldn't be shot in groups. But it is going on, and no one is saying very much of anything about it. Now, one of the strong points, of course, is keeping carnage at bay, that is to say, stopping it from happening. And once there are civil conflicts or invasions of one kind or another, that there would be UN agencies who could step in. The problem with that in the contemporary world is that, for example, the Israelis aren't necessarily allowing UN agencies in. Off and on they do, but then again they're not, so people are starving, food is not arriving, food hasn't arrived for a week, no, people are, eating grass again, insofar as there is grass. So that the UN agencies, which used to, after the Second World War, had pretty much good entree as neutral actors in situations of violence and conflict to help prevent carnage of various kinds, and help people, the UN's ability to act has been weakened. Now, the agencies themselves have gotten weakened. They need reform quite badly, but they also need funding. And of course, as you know, the United States, again, the most affluent country in the world, has withdrawn from several UN agencies, which would be the likely actors to prevent carnage and to help people survive it. The obvious one is the World Health Organization, which, as you know, the US has no further interest in. It's a UN agency we've left before, and we're leaving again. So that, again, the funding and the capacity of an international institution of which most countries in the world are members to help, A, deter carnage, and B, help further carnage once violence has broken out, has been seriously weakened. There's a different way of looking at some additional areas, which has to do not with conflict and war, but has to do with the lack of capacity to keep people who used to be kept alive. And that has to do with such things as tuberculosis, HIV, other diseases, which had been essentially managed and tapped down and prevented from spread in places like Africa, some places in Asia, by the capacity of funding for the mechanisms to vaccinate people on the one hand, and on the other hand, provide the survival that HIV people need. So again, the US and USAID has banned, most of the activities that helped in circumstances, and therefore what you now have is mass deaths beginning in various parts of the world. And of course, our own health ministries of various kinds are under the auspices of Mr. Kennedy, who has largely shut down research and vaccinations. The head of that organization, that part of the organization, has resigned. Other aspects have resigned. And Mr. Kennedy seems to be concentrating on resolving the problem of autism by September, he said. Unlikely. But in any event, not only has the US funding to organizations which help managing diseases, managing people who are ill, managing the spread of diseases, though underfunding and lack of provision, both on a bilateral and on the multilateral way, has essentially stopped. Now you can say, well, you don't particularly care whether lots of people who are HIV positive in places like South Africa and Botswana come to an early end if they can't get their medication, but that's not really our problem. Well, it is our problem, and increasingly it will become our problem, especially with diseases like tuberculosis, which is very infectious. And if you have a global increase in TB infections, sooner or later, people will be arriving from even through Europe and so forth, will be arriving with a TB positive, even if it's not as yet known to them, and will be spreading in the US. And the last thing we need is an outbreak of tuberculosis in the United States in the manner in which we're now having an outbreak in measles, although that wasn't necessarily brought from overseas. So the global health situation has so badly deteriorated, both because the most powerful and the richest country in the world has ceased to fund any of these things, but bilaterally into organizations that did the actual work, and is also simultaneously not contributing funding to the international institutions which can be of help and assistance. So the only thing you have left is non-governmental organizations, which, for example, many Americans contribute to Doctors Without Borders, and other institutions, but that's not a substitute for the massive technical knowledge and funding that was available from the United States. So in that sense, we are contributing to the actual through violence, and indirectly through the violence, if you will call that, through the spread of diseases and deaths from preventable diseases. Now you can say, well, okay, we're going to worry about ourselves. We don't have to worry about the rest of the world. That, of course, is not a recipe for very bad things happening in the United States, but is also a recipe for transmission into the United States, as I've just alluded to and mentioned. Now, is anybody stepping in? Is a political issue and not just a health and rescue issue. And yes, the Chinese are stepping in. And if one is interested in the balance of power, which the US appears to still be between itself and China, look at our tariffs and all of that discussion, then it might actually not be in the long-term policy interests for China to become increasingly the country that will help with carnage going on in all the ways that I have defined it in various parts of the world. The Chinese are equipped to deal with these situations at home and are increasingly equipping themselves to deal with them internationally as a substitute for the United States. And that's not just true in Asia, for example, during the crisis now in Myanmar, but is also happening, for example, in Latin America, where in many countries in Latin America, China is becoming much more influential than the United States. And you remember from school the Monroe Doctrine, Latin America was our backyard, so to speak. Well, in many ways, not only in terms of aid and economic activities and investments, but also in preventative health issues. China is spreading its wings. Finally, I just want to say that part of the carnage that's taking place in the world has very little to do with anything I've discussed so far, but has also to do with climate change and flooding. People are dying in various parts of the world, and it can almost be defined as carnage in some parts of near the Sahara and in other parts of the world due to climate change, where the temperature is so hot that people can't survive anymore. And they can't survive physically very often, but also they can't survive because they can't grow the things they used to grow, which allowed them to feed themselves. So climate change in terms of human survival and the carnage that occurs when large numbers of people simply can't survive and simply die, and often infants, but also older people prematurely, is also something I think that needs to be covered increasingly under the notion of the era of carnage. Ditto major floods, right? Floods which are new in their magnitude, which in bygone days could have been prevented or ameliorated, which are killing off the economic activities of people, even when it doesn't kill hundreds and thousands of people, which is also happening. So climate change, which seems to be on the back burner right now in terms of US policy. We don't believe in climate change anymore, and in any event, we're not concerned, so we can, have more cars, gasoline, oil exploration, and all the rest of it, and are less interested in funding climate change activities. That needs to be added, it seems to me, in terms of the era of carnage. And as you may or may not know, the US has quit the Paris Climate Change Organization, which is trying to cope on an international basis to allow countries which have the technical know-how to help the countries that don't have the technical know-how to prevent massive floods, droughts, various other aspects of climate change. So if you think in a slightly longer term, namely the rest of the century, then the fact that, again, that the most technologically advanced country, theoretically, in doing something about climate change, it has lost interest under the current administration, either domestically and certainly internationally, to do anything about it. One of the things that is notable right now is that very many small, poor countries are very sensitive to the climate change that is happening in their tropical environments and desert environments, and are very desirous of doing something about climate change in their own countries as quick as possible, to have rooftops and other mechanisms that allow them to generate the energy they need, electricity, without doing harm to the environment. And of course, one of the arguments that the US administration makes right now is that, well, what goes on in those countries is of no further interest to us, but they are a huge chunk of the world's population, billions of people. And the idea that they're willing to address climate change, but it requires financial contribution and technological contribution from the industrial world, seems to be, again, lost on US policy right now. But it is of great interest and policy, of interest to the members of the Paris Accords. And they are trying to raise the funds to help the poorer countries address climate change issues because they don't have the resources. Ironically, one of the things our administration seems to be interested in is immigrants, refugees, legal and illegal, as are European countries, I might add, from countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, right? From some countries in Latin America, if it's not for political reasons, like Venezuela. And there the argument is, why are people leaving those places? And part of why they're leaving those places is because they can no longer make a living in those places. And by the way, that includes Central America. Many of the illegal immigrants used to be farmers, and they can no longer make a living off the farms due to climate change. And therefore, they're leaving and becoming political headaches for the United States, for European countries, which don't want immigrants in large numbers coming to their society. So climate change and the carnage that happens in countries where climate change no longer allows people to survive is a high agenda item to be addressed in order to allow people to live and prosper, or at least survive where they happen to be living and not moving all over the world because they need, their survival is at risk. So even something as odd sounding as climate change can be consumed right now, but even more so in the years to come, under the rubric of this talk, which is the era of carnage, which is not just what humans are visiting on each other through warfare and through natural disasters and their inability to cope with natural disasters, but also has to do with climate change, which obviously climate change is not responsible for earthquakes, but climate change is responsible for major droughts in uninhabitable areas of various countries all over the world, Africa, some parts of Asia, Latin America, Central America, etc. So I'm suggesting, in a very bad place, and all decks hands need to be on decks. China is trying to some extent, substitute for the United States, being the second richest country in the world. Huge economy, not that there are other rich countries, but its biggest economy. And other countries are starting to step up. But the failure of the US to be a participant, to do its part, to use its financial and technological and medical knowledge to participate in this, comes at a very crucial time in this century. And the situation, even the other countries who are trying to substitute for the United States, are not collectively in a position to do as much as could be done if we in the US stepped up and participated fully, as we used to do in the past, and are no longer interested, seemingly, in doing so. It is very dangerous. It is very sad. It is very immoral in many ways. But here we are, and I think the more we inform ourselves of these issues and bug our representatives to take them seriously, not just in the narrow sense when there's actually a civil war, but in the broader sense that I tried to discuss today, we need to put shoulder to the wheel and help those non-governmental organizations which are helping people insofar as possible. Thank you very much. See you again in 2 weeks.